Hello and welcome to Infinity. I'm Charlie Seraphin. For the next half hour, we're going to be talking about shamanic counseling. Our guest is Dr. Leslie Gray, whose roots are with the Oneida, Powhatan, and Seminole Indians. She has a Ph.D. in clinical psychology. She completed a fellowship at Harvard University. Then she had a serious injury which did not respond to traditional medicine, so she went back to her roots and found a shaman who healed her. Years later, Leslie Gray became a shaman herself, and we'll get to that in a bit. But first, what is a shaman?
A shaman is a person who uses altered states of consciousness for the purpose of healing, gaining power, or knowledge. The word itself comes from the Turco-Tungusian Siberian languages, and it refers to that specific practitioner, a person who often uses drumming to put themselves in a trance and then either heal somebody in the tribe or tell them the direction that the game can be found in, or heal some tribal crisis.
Is it necessary that those people who take advantage of what the shaman is doing are also in an altered state of consciousness?
It's not necessary, but frequently that will be the case.
Okay. When you are trained in psychology or any other area of academic pursuit, you take a lot of time and you read a lot of books and you go to a big house or a big building where you are trained to do these things.
Yeah.
How do you get trained to be a shaman?
Well, that's an interesting question, because what is unique about shamans compared to other, say, religious practitioners, or let's say compared to yogis or psychics, is that shamans are people who primarily learn what they know through a direct link with the spirit world. They don't need an intermediary. They aren't part of a hierarchy like priests, so they don't necessarily go through a training like a medicine man. A medicine man also often goes through a formal training in a tribe and has a lot of practical abilities like bone setting and catching babies and that sort of thing. But the shaman usually learns what he or she does by a direct link with a guardian spirit that informs them what to do. That guardian spirit, in the case of North American Indians, is frequently what's called a power animal. But say amongst the Siberians, the guardian spirit is frequently a woman spirit that will instruct them in how to go about healing and curing.
When you're talking about a woman's spirit, are you talking about a female spirit or a particular woman's spirit?
No, a female spirit, a female being, as opposed to, say, an animal being, a female anthropomorphic figure.
Okay, in most of the movies that we're exposed to, which obviously have all kinds of flaws when they talk about North American Indians, but the medicine man is the shaman. The spiritual and the physical are interwoven.
Yeah, well, you'd have to really do a cross-cultural study of shamanism in order to see that in some tribes that role overlaps. In some tribes, the role of priest, medicine man, shaman, and chief all overlap in the same person, especially with a small tribe. It's sort of one very powerful figure. But in many tribes, especially larger tribes, those roles will be separate, and that's when you can clearly see what's unique about the role of the shaman. I mean, that word shaman, the anthropologists took it from a tribe where that role was so unique and it was so clear that it involved using that the use of altered states of consciousness to heal was the main thing that person was doing, that anthropologists then began to use it generically for wherever they saw that kind of a figure in a tribe. So they might say of one tribe, as in the case of Sitting Bull, Sitting Bull was both a chief and a shaman. So sometimes political power is included in the role of shaman, but sometimes not.
In our introduction, when we talked about you, we created the impression that once a shaman, always a shaman. You have been a shaman, but for a period of your life, you were not. It's something that you discovered in your being. Yes or no?
Much of my coming... Well, first of all, I don't call myself a shaman. I've never met a great shaman that calls himself a shaman. That's up to other people, and other people call you a shaman in a tribe when you start getting results. Okay, what I say is I practice shamanism. I've learned a lot of techniques from studying master shamans, from studying what they do, and I practice those techniques. And if people call me a shaman, great.
Okay. But you didn't always practice the techniques.
No, I didn't always. In fact, I used to practice psychotherapy, and I was an East Coast psychologist. And what happened to me was that I had a really bad accident, and no one could cure me. I went to 11 orthopedic surgeons, and I was in Boston at the time, the medical mecca of the United States, and I still couldn't get any help. And then an Indian woman friend of mine led me to a Cherokee shaman up in the Smoky Mountains, and he cured me. And after that happened, I just came back and questioned everything that I'd been taught, and everything that I'd been taught about what healing was, what the role of the psychologist was. This shaman had presence, had real power. And I looked around me in my graduate school, and I didn't see much of that. And also what he did was so rich and real and earthy and present and grounded. Compared to what I saw was a lot of abstraction and philosophizing about the nature of healing or the nature of the psyche. I do, however, it's very clear to me that this is the future direction that psychology will be going in. A recent issue of Brain Mind Bulletin that was devoted to the future of psychology stated that the future of psychology is guided imagery combined with altered states of consciousness. And when I read that, I just had to laugh, because that may be the future of psychology, but it's what shamans have been doing for 30,000 years. It's really old hat to shamanism. With the addition, however, actually the way Brain Mind Bulletin put it is very reductionistic. Guided imagery, step 1, combined with altered states of consciousness, step 2. But that really doesn't even begin to approach the extraordinary feats that you see shamans do. I mean, there's an element of the supernatural or the spiritual that happens when those two things are combined in a person with power, a person with mana.
You are consciously pursuing shamanism now. You say that you practice it.
Well,
maybe not consciously. Maybe that's a bad choice of words, but let's take that word out and say that you are pursuing shamanism right now.
I don't know if I'm pursuing it or it's pursuing me. I really had a call. I had a vision, and after that it felt inevitable. I actually resisted it. Between the time I got my PhD and the time I started practicing shamanism, about 2.5 years went by where I just didn't do anything. I felt stuck. I felt in a limbo between two places. I couldn't do what I'd been trained to do, and yet even though I'd been fascinated by shamans for years and had been following them around and admiring their abilities, it really didn't dawn on me to do it myself until I went to a shaman and I had an extraordinary vision. And then after that, I got an empty shoebox and an empty tuna can, and I said to myself that all the things I would need, like the power objects, like prayer fans and tobacco and sage and sweetgrass, would be given to me. And that way I'd know I was on the right path. And I just went around healing people, often for no money, for money if they had it. And people, bit by bit, gave me all the paraphernalia and things that I needed.
The question is, how many people are there, or do you have any idea, that are running around in the world right now that have this power?
In Western European society and in the United States of America, not many. I mean, they're primarily in the United States, those indigenous peoples, those Native North Americans who are still practicing shamanism on the reservation. So there are not many. But in the rest of the world, very many. Only 10% of all the healing on the planet Earth is done by Western-style MDs. The other 90% is done by folk healers. And in many of the third world countries, they're beginning to reject Western-style medicine as they see its failures in the West. And in countries like Nigeria, they are combining in the hospitals the native shamans with the Western-trained Nigerian doctors, and that they find that has much more acceptability by the people.
Could just by random chance people that are not trained in natural healing or shamanism have those powers and abilities? I mean, are they covered over
Sure.
culturally?
I think many people have altered state experiences in this culture, but this culture doesn't provide any place for the recognition or the training of those abilities, which I think is tragic. That's beginning to change. There are some things, shamanism is beginning to come into popular awareness. You see it's sort of beginning with the Carlos Castaneda books in the late 60s, things like Joan Halifax's Shamanic Voices, Michael Harner's current book, The Way of the Shaman, and it's even coming up in movies now. the Emerald Forest, a beautiful example of shamanism. I'm very sensitive to the way that shamanism is treated in the media. It's usually stereotyped as witchcraft or as, mumbo jumbo and completely misperceived. I thought the treatment in Emerald Forest was very sensitive, very delicate, very accurate. Also in, what was that book about? Never Cry Wolf. The movie Never Cry Wolf. There was an Eskimo shaman in that. I'm even told in The Right Stuff, which I didn't see, there's an Aborigine shaman in the movie The Right Stuff. So you're beginning to see inklings of it. There's a very popular book called Medicine Woman by Lynn Andrews, which is about a woman shaman. So I see it creeping into the awareness of the culture. And I think this is going to happen more and more because shamanism is more in line with the changing paradigm of quantum mechanics. It reflects it because it reflects it more than Western medicine and more than Western psychology, because it is based on the total interconnectedness of all things.
Let's go back to the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
When someone goes to a shaman, what do they do? What do they see? What happens?
Okay, why don't I talk about my own work, which I call shamanic counseling. When someone comes to see me, first of all, I usually ask them where they feel out of balance, body, mind, or heart, because shamanism sees health as the balance of those three areas. And then, depending on where they're out of balance, I do a ceremony using cedar, sage, sweetgrass, tobacco to put them back in balance. Then I teach them how to journey, how to alter their own state of consciousness, to visit either the upper world or the lower world, so that they can get in contact with a guardian spirit. And then, bit by bit, I do problem solving with them, with the actual problems in their own lives, where they get the answer from the spirit world to their problems. I also blow power into them. I blow a guardian spirit first into their chest, and then I sit them up and I blow it into the fontanelle. After I do this, it is extraordinary what happens. There are a tremendous amount of synchronicities that begin to happen in a person's life. Things seem to fit together, to make more sense. The person feels more personally powerful. They become more resistant to ill health. Interestingly enough, I don't have any philosophy that goes along with this. I don't believe in any philosophy. I ended up in shamanism because I'm radically pragmatic. I mean, one of the things I do is I teach research methodology. And people say to me, how can you teach research methodology and practice shamanism? But to me, they absolutely go together. If you are totally empirical, you will be very attracted to shamanism. I notice that when I use eagle feathers on people, they get better. I don't have a philosophy about why this happens, and I frankly don't care.
What is a power animal? You talked about that early on.
A power animal is the native North American term for a cross-cultural worldwide phenomenon in shamanism, which is the acquiring of a guardian spirit. North American Indians usually acquire that guardian spirit in the form of an animal. But when we talk about an animal, in this case, we're not talking about a bear or a fox or an eagle. We are talking about the power of bear, the power of fox, the power of eagle, the posture or quality of that animal being on the planet Earth. And animals are seen very much by Native North Americans as not separate from us and as almost in a way superior, in the sense that they are those who came before, and they are in that sense wise. Animals don't go around questioning what they're doing here. People do. People get mixed up, but animals don't, and in that sense they're seen as prototypic. Yes.
Let's take it a step further.
Yeah.
For some people listening, the Western concept would be when you talk about the power of a bear, you're talking about the physical power of a large animal that has a lot of bulk and claws and teeth and that sort of thing. What do you really mean when you say the power of a bear?
The qualities of that animal.
What are the qualities?
posture.
Let's take the bear, if we can use one as an example.
Well, bears don't have a lot of enemies. They usually rule the territory where they are. They're extreme survivors. They eat almost anything. They dig for roots. They hunt game. And they have a kind of majesty about them. Amongst many North American Indians, the bear is the animal that's associated with the direction of the West, which is the dark, the looks within place, spirit of introspection.
The bear also, in practical terms, was critically linked to the sustenance of the tribe. It provided
Absolutely.
clothing.
Absolutely.
It provided the
And when
part of the jewelry,
when a
the
whole
meat.
family or clan within a tribe adopts the characteristics of that animal, that's when you talk about a totem. It's more inherited. It's seen as the ancestral spirit of a whole clan within a tribe. So there's often a bear clan in an American Indian tribe. But we're talking about now is having the bear as your personal guardian spirit, which you might acquire it by going on a vision quest, by fasting and going without food for several days. Or in some tribes you might acquire it just by listening to monotonous drumming, chanting, and rattling. That is the main technique that I use with my clients, is repetitious drumming. It is a fact that's been studied by Andrew Nahier, an anthropologist and physiologist, that if you listen for 10 to 20 minutes to regular monotonous drumming, that your brain waves will literally shift into the theta region at a frequency of 6 to 8 cycles per second, which is the region for visioning, the region for dreaming. And I do that with my clients in my office. I have them listen to drumming, and so that it entrains their brainwaves so that they literally can shift into an altered state. But unlike the experience you have when you take hallucinogens, this can be stopped at any time. I mean, one of the classic methods for getting in an altered state in shamanism is to take yahe or ayahuasca or any of the various hallucinogens. Well, that's sort of like a dynamite approach. You don't really need to use something that strong. You can use simple drumming and achieve an altered state. And the wonderful thing about the drumming is you can stop that anytime that you want to. Whereas if you take a 8-hour hallucinogen, you have an 8-hour experience whether you want it or not.
When we talk about healing, the way that you do it and the way that you were healed, what does that suggest about the nature of pain or the problem in the first place?
Yeah, well, that's a really good question. What I'm seeing more and more in my work, in which I had a hunch, I had a hunch about this when I was still in the field of psychology, because I wrote my PhD dissertation on problem solving and on how to get unstuck when you're stuck in an insoluble problem. It seems that what's important about getting out of a difficult situation or overcoming a crisis is your perception of your own power, as opposed to your, shall we say, literal or actual or so-called real power. That it's more important how you experience yourself than what you're actually, what others might perceive as your power. Is that going to the heart of your question? I mean,
I think so.
Because one of the things I change is I change people's perception of their own power. I change their experience of their own power.
So you don't heal them; they heal themselves?
It's somewhere in between. I guess you might say I am the occasion of the healing that they do on themselves in their own altered state.
Does it ever happen without a shamanic ritual? Does the same process, can two people get together and have the same result without using the same means?
I'm not sure I know what you mean by that. I mean, I'm sure that the phenomenon of an altered state, a shamanic altered state, or a shamanic state of consciousness has occurred spontaneously at various times. But I think it would be highly unlikely for two people to accidentally affect a cure.
Okay. What is the specific role of the tools, the things that you mentioned earlier, the eagle's feather? I know you don't have a philosophy about it, but I'm sure you've thought about it.
Well, see, to me it's powerful because a very powerful medicine person gave me those eagle feathers. And a lot of the power objects in shamanism acquire power by virtue of whose hands they've passed through. That's true of particularly of using crystals and using various rocks that are used in shamanism. But with Native North Americans, eagle feathers are considered to be very powerful by virtue of the very nature of that bird, which is often equated with the Great Spirit.
Since touching physical objects and then passing them on, if a powerful person touches them and gives them to you, they become more powerful tools. What does that suggest about the laying on of hands? Is that involved in your work? Do you use your hands in contact with the people that come to you?
I do, but it's not necessary. Some shamans do and some shamans don't in different tribes. One of the reasons I do is that I worked with a Pomo shaman. I still am working with a Pomo shaman right now, and the Pomo shamans use their hands and convey something called weya, which is a general word meaning energy or power. Convey that through their hands, and Pomo shamans, for instance, don't actually use the drumming to get an altered state. They use their dreams to get information about how they should heal or cure.
So theirs is more one-sided, their approach? I mean, are they setting the direction more than, you said when
No, they get
patient
visited.
or client comes to you, you ask them a question first.
They get visited by spirits in their dreams, and the spirits instruct them as what to do.
What are those dreams? Are they more, some people suggest that everything that we're doing is a dream.
Uh-huh.
Is that, obviously, if the dream holds the key to the healing, then the dream has some more elements of reality than the waking state.
Well, first of all, if everything that we're doing is a dream, then it isn't any different than if everything we're doing isn't a dream. Either way. And shamans tend to be very sophisticated when they talk about altered states. You can conceive of it as a shamanic state of consciousness, which you might call the SSC, and an ordinary state of consciousness, which you might call the OSC. And when you're in the OSC, the ordinary state of consciousness, things in the SSC might seem unreal. But when you're in the shamanic state of consciousness, things in the ordinary state of consciousness usually seem unreal. I mean, very often in the past, an anthropologist has gone and visited a shaman and said, well, what did you do today in some tribal village? And the shaman would say, well, I woke up this morning, I had breakfast, I went out hunting. When I was out hunting, an enormous golden eagle swept me up into the sky, shot arrows into my brain of power, and then set me back down on the ground again. I finished hunting, I came home, and I had dinner. And the anthropologist would sort of, in the past, used to say, oh, look at this fellow, the poor person is so primitive that he doesn't understand the difference between fantasy and reality. Whereas in fact, the shaman is so sophisticated that when you talk, the whole tribe is so sophisticated about altered states that you would no more explain that happened in an altered state than you would be likely to say to someone, I flew to New York by plane. You don't have to add that you did it by plane. You could just say, I flew to New York. It's the same way that shamanic cultures are very sophisticated about talking about altered states.
Again, I suppose this is a dumb question, but I always get to ask at least one really dumb question. If you go to dreams for answers, does that suggest that there is, you talked about the higher world and
the upper world,
the
and
upper
the lower
world and the lower world.
Yeah.
Is that where the answers are?
Yes, for shamans, the universe or power is tripartite. It's divided into three parts: a lower world, which is usually a very earthy place where the power animals are, and it's mountains and rivers and lakes and this sort of thing. And then the middle world, which is the world of consensus reality. We could probably get 10 people to agree that that's a microphone. We might not get 10 people to agree that my power animal is right over my shoulder. The middle world, this world of consensus reality. Then the upper world is the land of the dead, the land of the ancestors, the land of those who have already crossed over to the other side. Shamans are people who empower themselves in this middle world by making journeys down to the lower world and bringing back up power, or making journeys to the land of the ancestors and bringing power back and infusing themselves or others with power in this middle world.
Is it tough to translate the traditional concepts of shamanism into English?
Very tough. It's extremely difficult because it involves, even as I talk to you now, there's so much more subtlety in the actual experience than in the way that it's coming out in English words right now. So much more sophistication.
Is the word for God a noun or a verb? We talked to a linguist on the program who suggested that he had done some studies with North American Indian tribes, and one of the difficulties he had in figuring things out is that the word for God was a verb, and there wasn't a noun as such.
Well, I'm not exactly acquainted with that, but I know that if you take, for example, the Sioux word wakan, which is very often used in reference to what American Indians regard as the Great Spirit, or wakan tanka. Wakan is so often translated in literature as sacred, whereas in fact a much closer translation is power. And see, power really implies an active force in the world, whereas sacred doesn't, and sacred is much closer to our Western European Christian notions. And I think that what indigenous peoples of America experience is much more closely translated by the idea of power. And that's what shamans do. They empower people far more than that they say, pronounce spiritual sayings over them, or try to get or try to return the person to a religion. It's much more than that. It's that they re-inspirit the person, reactivate them.
What's the biggest impediment in Western society to vision?
Oh, God. You're asking some very good questions. So many things I can hardly... It's funny, there are a tremendous number of things that are impediments to vision, and yet I have found that when you just scratch the surface of most Western Europeans or Euro-Americans, that it's right there, ready to come out. Connection with the universe, connection with spirit. Because I think most of the shamanism existed in Europe, northernmost Europe, up until the late 19th century. I mean, shamanism is the heritage of European people, as well as Native Americans, Siberians, Africans, Aborigine Australians. And so it's much longer in their racial memory. I mean, most European countries have been shamanic for thousands and thousands of years, and only in a mere handful of years have they been Christian.
Do you have a vision for the world?
Well, I have a personal vision for the world. I don't have a vision that I foster among my clients. I mean, I allow them to have whatever vision of the world that they care to. But I think that the vision of most people who practice shamanism is one of the interconnectedness of all things, one of things being in balance, one of being in what you might call right harmony, right relation to nature and the earth and what's around, which is a different view from the historical Western European idea of dominating nature, of controlling the forces. My vision is to come into harmony with nature.
Are you optimistic?
Oh, sure. Why not?
Could you give an example of someone that you've worked with recently that was cured?
Yeah. Someone came to me who actually came to a tobacco smoke ceremony that I used to hold, and this person was a psychotherapist. And she was new in town. She had recently been through a divorce. She was also adjusting to living with a new lover. She had gained a whole lot of weight. She felt very sad at that time. She had not met a lot of new people, so she was lonely and isolated. And she was not getting new clients, and basically felt like she didn't have the energy to go out and do it, to do the things that would connect her with the community in order to begin practicing in her new location. And so I worked with her for about 3 months. Over the course of that time, a turning point came when I blew a guardian spirit into her. And that night, she went home and she had a dream that an enormous red spider attached itself to her crotch. Okay, and then she came to me and told me this dream. It had much more there was much more in the dream, and it was a very gory, gruesome dream. And at the end of telling me the dream, she said, "Well, what does that mean?" And I said, "Well, although psychology or psychotherapy might want to interpret the dream, in shamanism, the thing to do would be to remove the spider." So I told her to lie down on the floor, and I took my rattle in one hand and my crystal the other, and I began shaking the rattle to put myself into an altered state where I could enter her vision and remove the harmful power intrusion. As I was doing this, a spider walked up beside